Chapter 7. 15:15 hours, April 14th, 2539. Military calendar. Geosynchronous orbit above boundary equator aboard UNSC Punic-class supercarrier Neferis. Arthur and Solomon had received a word that Spartans Cal and Sheila had just requested permission to land in Bay 124 on the starboard side, third deck. A relatively short jaunt away by ship standards. They had just wrapped up their initial briefing with First Lieutenant Green and his platoon sergeant, so they decided to take a much-needed respite from reviewing the operational deployment of Teal Force, and decided to greet their sisters in arms. Still donning their service uniforms from the day prior, Solomon and Arthur made their way to the nearest elevator down to the deck, which Cal and Sheila were set to arrive. "When's the last time you heard from either of them?" Solomon keyed the button on the control panel next to the door, and the twin shutters of the frame sealed tight. They began to accelerate down the length of the ship's superstructure. "I can't even remember Cyrus 7, maybe. It's been so long I can't keep track anymore." In his mind, Arthur rifled through the numerous campaigns he had participated in over the years. The number had grown so high and the tempo so unyielding that each mission tended to blur into the next anymore. Thus was the life of a Spartan. He had come to terms with who and what he was years ago, and he wouldn't have it any other way. He made his peace with what happened to him and all the other conscripted children over 20 years ago. In the long days and even longer nights of solitude when not shivering from the cold on a field exercise or being beat up by a trainer, Arthur convinced himself how necessary he was to help humanity. Dr. Halsey had told them all so many times. 6 years, huh? I suppose it has been. I remember that mission. Felt good to finally be on the giving end of the stick for once in this damn war, Solomon said and chuckled with a hearty smile. Remember the look on that elite's face when we landed in the hangar of his own squadron's Banshees? He erupted with a bellyful laughter. They never saw it coming. They were excited to work with Sheila and Cal again. He didn't participate with them much during their time as cadets back on Reach, but had always been fond of them. Solomon was one of the few odd ducklings under CPO Mendez's tutelage. Unlike most of the children who tended to keep to themselves, always trying to keep their edge. Children like Solomon, Jorge 052, and Kurt 051 were extroverted to the point of reprimand. Kurt was often seen conversing with other units, getting to know their soldiers and support staff. Jorge, always the big teddy bear, cared more of what people thought and how they felt than being a blunt instrument. Solomon, likewise, had an infectious personality, his mouth moving faster than his brain during training. The elevator shuddered to a halt and the doors slid open. The pair of Spartans stepped out onto the slip-resistant hangar deck to arrive at a cavernous metal room. To their left, Arthur noticed a group of flight crew tending to their longsword, conducting maintenance pre-flight checklists as the crew chief reviewed the underbelly armaments. Farther beyond were a vast array of other machinery and spacecraft ranging from forklifts to Pelican dropships and Warthog assault vehicles to broadswords. It was easy to get caught up in the enormity of the hangar, one of the largest on the supercarrier. What Arthur was most interested in, however, was the pristine Pelican just setting down in its designated landing area. Orange safety lights were rotating in a familiar pattern which signaled the new arrivals on their final destination. Arthur and Solomon continued past the hurried flight crews tending to their birds and skirted around the Pelican. Heat still radiated from the underwing rotors, warming their faces as they approached the rear loading ramp. 2 Spartans appeared at the back of the ramp, both completely encased in their Mjolnir suits and ready to take on anything that came their way. The pair greeted Arthur and Solomon with a quick swipe of their index and middle fingers across their faceplates. The gesture was as grand as it was fleeting, and was the warmest reception Arthur would receive. Colloquially known as the Spartan smile, the subtle action was about as personal as the super soldiers tended to get. A simple gesture, but one loaded with sentiment, and one that only a select few in the entire United Nations Security Council knew of. "Welcome to Teal Force, Spartans. Good to see you again," Arthur remarked, and moved out of the armored soldier's way. He and Solomon strode up the ramp of the Pelican and began throwing satchels over to Sheila and Cal, then onto their own shoulders. The brass must be getting desperate if they're putting you in charge, sir, Sheila said while situating a field pack over the breastplate of her Mjolnir CQC variant armor. A deep cobalt hue reflected the amber warning lights above to cast a shadow toward the Pelican. You better watch it, Sheila, Solomon said with a devious flash in his eye. I heard on his last assignment he vacked a platoon commander for putting him on security detail. It was Cal that came to his rescue. A soft tone came over a helmet speaker to Solomon's flank. Well, we wouldn't want that, would we? She bumped her compatriot's shoulder, throwing her off balance. A not-so-subtle hint to lay off their new team leader. A few moments passed as they loaded up their gear and the four began to head back to the elevator. Where to, Teal leader? Cal broke their silence. The foursome crammed into the elevator designed for personnel almost half their size. We've been detailed a platoon of Space Assault ODSTs for the mission, Arthur began. While Solomon and I suit up, you two can get acquainted. We'll drop you off on the gun deck where 1st Lieutenant Green of the 2nd Shock Troops Battalion and his men are getting prepped for departure. They should be ready by now. Very well. It'll be nice to have some backup for a change. Maybe even a little CAS if we're lucky. Cal chuckled softly. She was referring to the Spartans' history of missions always tending to go awry. More precisely, the fact that they always seemed to end up without friendly forces to support them during their maneuvers. Once again, the elevator doors slid open, this time to reveal a crowded preparation room with a few dozen Marines clad in vacuum-rated jet-black space assault armor. Lieutenant Green's the young one with the blonde low reg in the far corner, Solomon said, and crooked a thumb over his shoulder and toward the rear of the compartment. See you soon. After a quick session in the Spartan support module located adjacent to their temporary berthing quarters, Arthur and Solomon were fully encased in their tech suit underlayer and titanium A-hardened alloy shells. Standing to their full height in the armor, they gave each other a quick once-over. Arthur turned around to face away from Solomon while his HUD's biosystem conducted its boot-up sequence and counter-intrusion package initiation, and displayed his team's vital signs in the corner of his eye. Solomon opened the hatch situated above the small of Arthur's back to reveal the interface to his suit's micro-fusion reactor. The size no larger than that of his own forearm, the fusion reactor used an impressive system to harness the power of charged particles fusing in a controlled chamber to emit selective ions from the discharge chamber to the collection chamber. The resulting process turned rotational energy into directed energy that the rest of the suit systems could utilize to propel the wearer. He read the readout on the diagnostics display and found the system nominal. He closed and sealed the port once more and reviewed the rest of the components on the rear of Arthur's suit. Apparently satisfied with his pre-mission check, Solomon turned his back on Arthur and the team leader did the same in kind. All good, Solomon, Arthur said. He gave his partner a quick slap on the shoulder and removed his helmet once again. The two began down the many corridors and were greeted by Lieutenant Green, his platoon sergeant, and the rest of Teal Force. The term being used for the 4 Spartan comprised of Teal Team plus the ODST platoon. Arthur and Solomon stopped several paces from the young platoon commander, came to attention, and snapped off a quick salute. At ease, Spartans. Lieutenant Green flicked a quick salute back. Captain Fulton is waiting. Let's get in there. The crew present comprised of the 4 Spartans, platoon commander, platoon sergeant, and 3 squad leaders, who fell into place near the rear of the bridge briefing room. A cramped yet ornate room similar in design to the officer's wardroom was decorated with hanging pictures of great leaders of history's past, UNSC ships of the line, and most importantly, with the image of Boundary's solar system. Get comfortable, ladies and gentlemen. Captain Fulton vaguely acknowledged the posse of soldiers filing into the rear of the room near the shadow of the holographic projector. Before Teal Force were several officers and senior non-commissioned officers, each tasked with a vital role in the days to come. Arthur scanned the room and identified each of the rate and rank patches on their shoulder boards or sleeves. Engineering officers, navigators, squadron commanders, field-grade officers charged with deploying to the surface with their battalions, and an Oni field officer skulking in the corner of the room. An otherwise unimpressive man of medium build, his presence was betrayed by the scowl he wore on his face and the telltale all-black utilities he wore. No insignia or patches. The AI Aretes came into view on the table and began to outline the task force commander's strategy to evacuate the civilian population on Boundary over the following few days. The plan called for the Neferis to deploy its marine complement to the surface and work in tandem with the planetary militia to fortify the city and create obstacles for the aliens upon their arrival. With luck, Captain Fulton expressed, the Covenant would attempt a land invasion instead of a plasma bombardment right out of the gate. He had heard of entire worlds being spared of glassing, but no one knew why some planets were spared, and others immediately fired upon. Arthur listened intently but already had his own plans in mind. While the Marine forces went to the capital and the Navy established a picket line for direct action and long-range reconnaissance flights, he and the Teal Force would deploy to a select few areas around the city centers and initiate hit-and-run tactics to disrupt troop formations, look for targets of opportunity, and provide fire control for ground and air units in their areas of operation. The captain droned on through the mission briefing. And from there, we should expect contact from this location, contingent on their approach from most probable vector. He guided his finger around some projected path of a heavenly body that filled a portion of the room. Finally, we will take a defensive position on the far side of the moon here and co-opt Governor Huxley's plan to slingshot projectiles. And, with any luck, disable hostile shields in time for a max strike. Captain Fulton was referring to the desperately genius ploy to slingshot derelict, non-slip space-capable craft into the Covenant battleships to score some lucky hits. Arthur wasn't much for naval warfare, much like any Spartan. He preferred his boots on the cold, hard ground where he was in an even fight, where humans still held the advantage. Any questions? Captain Fulton surveyed the room and saw only set jaws and serious expressions. Many of his division heads, section leaders, and his complement of Marine commanders were seasoned, having seen destruction and devastation wrought by the Covenant on several occasions over the last decade. The task force commander glanced over to Arthur, only recognizing who he was by the number designation on his left breastplate that read 079. He paused for a moment to take in the sight of 4 fully armored Spartans in his midst, awestruck from the knights in gunmetal gray armor before him. He snapped out of his stupor. Teal Leader, I'm counting on you and your team to answer any surprises these bastards have cooked up for us. Yes, sir. Arthur snapped off a brisk salute and threw his body back to parade rest as the captain returned the salute. Lieutenant Green and I have our deployment prepared, and I've transmitted the flight path and first LZ to Aretes. Excellent, Fulton said. With your permission, sir, the Spartan leader began again. I'd like to get moving. I have 2 Heron transports ready to depart. D-20 Herons, or as the jet jockeys called them, Big Bricks, were massive transport vessels capable of transferring base-building materials from orbit to ground. Before the briefing, Arthur had called up his equipment list detailed to Teal Force by Captain Fulton and Admiral Cole, and noticed it was much more generous than he was used to. Included in their Spartan package were 2 Herons, a few Pelican dropships including a /R reconnaissance bird, small and medium arms enough for a company of Marines, and myriad of other tools and equipment. He'd take advantage of anything he could take. Very well, Spartan, I won't hold you. Good luck and Godspeed, dismissed. The leaders of Teal Force all stood to attention, snapped a simultaneous salute, and conducted an about-face. They filed one by one out the rear of the briefing room as Captain Fulton's voice began to trail off into nothing behind them, wrapping up his briefing to discuss the orbital fire support plan once they initiated contact with the enemy. Teal Force arrived at the hangar they would depart from on the lower decks of the Neferis. Lieutenant Green and his counterpart, Staff Sergeant Thompson, walked abreast with Arthur in the lead. Staff Sergeant Thompson was an imposing figure. A veteran of several campaigns, many thought him as overqualified to remain as a platoon sergeant to such a young officer. He had seen action since the second campaign to recapture Harvest, earning a ragged scar across the lower half of his jaw, terminating in deep burn scars around his collarbone. His eyes were steel gray and piercing. He had a square jawline and a flat top, closely cropped. The team leadership continued to move into the recesses of the hangar, passing crew members as they moved. Staff Sergeant Thompson put a finger to his ear and muttered some imperceptible phrase into his communications device. Farther down the hangar, Arthur noticed a flurry of bodies scrambling to get into position. Sergeant Thompson broke off from the group and took position to their flank to call the platoon to attention. As the platoon sergeant fell into his position at the front of the rows and columns of gear-laden troops, Arthur motioned for Solomon to put his helmet on. At once, he did the same and spoke. "Solomon Kalshila." Arthur finished his order over the TEAMCOM encrypted single-beam signal. "Fall in." The 3 Spartans peeled off from the group and settled in smartly to the flank of the ODST platoon. The squad leaders under Lieutenant Green did the same and fell in at the front of the formation, with the platoon sergeant leading. Arthur and Lieutenant Green slowed their steps in anticipation of a report. Arthur chose a position to Lieutenant Green's side while Staff Sergeant Thompson saluted the young leader, giving his report. "All present and accounted for, sir. Ready to kick ass and send these sorry assholes back to hell." Arthur noted the professionalism and strict adherence to detail. The formation's ranks were tight and orderly, each Marine's equipment secured properly and cared for with the tenderness of a doting mother. Arthur noted the discipline as the staff sergeant finished his salute, turned about smartly, and took his place closer to the Spartans on his flank. Lieutenant Green called the formation at ease and began to look over his troops with care, knowing this may very well be the last time he'd see all of them, or at least some of them, alive. "Marines," he started, "you've proven yourselves capable and ruthless time and again. I'm asking you once more to jump with me, feet first." The platoon erupted in a violent counter-response. "To hell. Lady Fortune seems to have found us this time around, as you can see. This," he gestured to Spartan 079, "is Spartan Arthur 079. He'll have tactical control of our deployment to Boundary and takes his orders direct from Captain Fulton, understand?" A sea of dipped chins responded in silence. "We won't be deploying with the rest of the Marines. Our orders are to inflict as much damage as we can, however we see fit. The militia ground side has instructions to protect their citizens and assist with evacuation efforts. Our air squadrons and ground forces will be tied up stacking bodies on their end, so let's get creative." He began walking up and down the rows of Marines, taking care to display on his face a look of fervor and intensity. These men and women responded to confidence, and he wanted to make them all feel like they could literally jump into hell and take out the devil himself. "Captain Fulton has given us the green light to start loading up into the Pelicans and get this goat rodeo on the road. Once we get boots on the ground, the show is ours. We have free rein on this one to augment the militia topside, and will go as needed to accomplish key objectives during the mission." Now the flight crews were beginning to emerge from their cockpits and troop bays, making final preparations and stealing a glance toward the elite orbital drop shock troopers. "Yep, you've all heard the plan and the squad leaders have the details. Last thing." He took a more serious tone and came to a pointed stance toward the Spartan team next to him. "What any of the Spartans say is as good as my word. Listen to them and they'll keep you alive." Lieutenant Green took a position at the front of the platoon once again. "Staff Sergeant Thompson." The platoon sergeant fell out and inserted himself at a position equidistant from the squad leaders and his platoon commander. He came to attention. "Conduct final inspections, load up the rest of our gear, and prepare for departure. 3 minutes. Dismissed," Lieutenant Green ordered. The veteran platoon sergeant promptly dismissed the platoon. Everyone knew their roles. After so many years of fighting, it was second nature. Lieutenant Green turned and walked toward the Spartans. Without a word, the group entered the nearest Pelican where the rest of First Squad was already aboard, and checking each other's gear a final time. With Arthur's mission clock counting down in the top left corner of his heads-up display, he took his seat at the rear of the dropship, noticing the rotor wash beginning to spill across the flight deck. His timer read 0013 as the Pelican rotated and its tilt rotor jets angled to propel them out of the hangar bay doors of the supercarrier. At 0000, the Pelican accelerated, barreling toward the planet with their mobile base support craft in tow. The plan called for each Pelican to establish forward operating facilities in 4 key locations around the capital, so as the crew entered low orbit, they would depart ways. While Teal Force was departing toward the planet, Captain Fulton and Arades began to detail support craft to locations around the City of Salvation as well. They conferred with the air boss and battalion commanders. The plan was relatively straightforward for now. Fortify hardpoints at key locations around the perimeter of the city, and prepare for naval strikes in orbit to buy time for the civilian transports to evacuate. His logistics officer notified him that the rest of the fleet were deploying their limited complements of firebase support vehicles and other craft, so he decided to use this time to hail the governor and notify her of the plan. "Governor Huxley, this is Captain Fulton again," he chimed over the comm. "I've begun to deploy troops, supplies, and base building materials to supplement your forces. Once the fleet has finished on their end, our Prowler will finish laying their mines and find a nice dark corner to set up shop and begin long-range observation. We will depart shortly and get situated on the far side of the moon." A moment of silence filled the bridge before a response came over the speaker. "Understood, Commander." It was General Grant to respond this time, not the governor. Captain Fulton wondered if there were any underlying issues on the other end of the line. "Sir, Dunkirk and Pelium report finished with material and troop deployment and ready for departure," Lieutenant Morales said. This signified that all ships' complement of soldiers, vehicles, communications equipment, ammunition, and the rest of the gamut of resources needed to fuel an army for a few days' time. "Outstanding. Open the fleet channel," Captain Fulton ordered. He addressed his handful of ships, and they set course for the dark side of Tarvos, Boundary's sole moon.